Hi there. Good afternoon. Welcome to this afternoon's webinar. This is the Confidently Present Your Qualitative Results chapter webinar. I am Rachel. I am here with Statistics Solutions. I'm a senior qualitative research mentor, data analyst. We are a full service dissertation consulting company at Statistics Solutions, and we are really here for you as you're writing your dissertation at any stage. So that might be from topic development all the way through to your final PowerPoint for your final dissertation proposal and all of the chapters in between. So this webinar is on your qualitative results chapter. Again, I'm Rachel. I also have Isades with me. She will be helping out with any of the technological things during the webinar. And if you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to pop those into the question and answer box. Isades will be answering anything really related to the array of services that we provide at Statistics Solutions. And at the end of the presentation, I will answer any questions about qualitative results. Okay, so again, you can just pop those into the question and answer box as they arise during the webinar, and we'll have some time for questions and answers at the end. You will also receive a copy of today's webinar tomorrow along with the slideshow. Okay. So this webinar really covers those basic aspects of your qualitative results chapter. So I have this set up based on what I have seen from really a variety of schools that my clients have attended. Okay, these are the most common sections that will go into your results chapter. And so they may not all be applicable to you, and that's perfectly fine. Okay, but I guarantee that if you hit each of these sections in your qualitative results chapter, you will be more than covered in the end. Okay, you will have a full and complete qualitative results chapter that you can present with confidence. So those main sections are the introduction, the setting, the demographics, data collection, data analysis, results, trustworthiness, and summary. So we will talk a little bit more about what each of these entails in turn. In your introduction to the chapter, you really want to just focus on restating the problem and the purpose of your study. Okay, here you are reminding your readers of what your research is about and what those research questions that you were trying to answer were. Okay, and you also want to preview the chapter. Just give kind of a highlight here of each of the sections in the chapter, right? So I like to think about this not just for the introduction and not just section by section, but really for the whole dissertation, that you are taking your reader on a journey and you're holding their hand as they read. So nothing should be a big sort of surprise at the end. Everything should make sense and follow logically from what came before. Okay, so if you think about this as holding your reader's hand and reminding them of some of these key points along the way, and again, not just in your results chapter, then you should be in really good shape. Okay, so reiterate the problem and the purpose, talk about your research questions, and preview the chapter, and you're done with your introduction. So then you can move on to the setting. Now, these next couple of sections are going to look very familiar because you already talked about these in your methods chapter. Okay, what's different here? The way that I like to think about this is your chapter 3 is the expectation, and the chapter 4, the results, are the reality. So in your methods chapter, you have designed your study based on, if everything goes absolutely according to plan, here is what you plan to do. Okay. In your results chapter, you talk about what changed. because the world isn't perfect. We're working with real live human beings. We're in the middle of a global pandemic and everything is different. And that's perfectly fine. Your results chapter is where you get to talk about how everything changed from what you planned to do in your methods chapter. So in your research setting, talk about where you conducted the research and why this was important for understanding your problem, purpose, and research questions. And here you talk about any conditions that may have influenced your research. Okay, I'm willing to bet that most of you were planning to have a nice sit down face-to-face with participants to do in-depth interviews in a private location, maybe a room in a library or something like that. And nobody's doing that right now. It's all on Zoom or Skype or something like that. That's perfectly fine. That this is where you talk about that. Okay. Any conditions that influenced your participants as well. Okay. Anything that might have impacted the interpretation of your results. Okay. This is where you put all of that into context for the reader. Okay. So the whole of the research setting, what was that like? How did it impact your study? How did it impact your participants? And then you can move on to the demographics section. In this section, you want to provide information about your participants. Okay, so this could be, the gender of participants. It could be age groups. It could be occupation. Maybe it's important for your readers to know that, one group of people, one group of your participants had been at a particular job for over 10 years and one group had been at the job for under 10 years. Anything that's relevant to the study, those characteristics that help us make sense of your study and in particular, those results. Okay, that's what's really important to convey here. So if there are characteristics of your participants that are less important for understanding that, you may opt to leave those out. Okay, because we do in some ways want to paint with broad strokes here because we want to maintain confidentiality. So we don't want to get too detailed as to, be able to identify who a participant is. One way to present demographics is through just a table, which can be very, very helpful for just seeing very clearly, who participant 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and so on were, and all of their relevant characteristics. And if you use a table, that's perfectly fine, but you do want to talk a little bit about what you are presenting in that table. It also might be appropriate to present something of a participant sketch. So something in narrative form where you might, describe who each participant is. And again, painting with broad strokes here to ensure that you maintain confidentiality, but it is certainly appropriate in some cases to provide a participant sketch as opposed to a demographic table. The next section should have something about your data collection. Okay, and like with the section for the research setting, this is your here's what happened in reality section. So you planned for your data collection in your methods chapter. You outlined all of the steps that you were going to take to collect data, all the way from, obtaining IRB approval to obtaining permission to use the research site, all the way through how you are going to conduct member checking with your participants. So you had all of that planned out, and maybe it went the way that you had planned and maybe it didn't. But in your data collection section here in your results chapter, this is where you talk about what, if anything, changed. You talk about the reality, what actually happened. So how many participants did you recruit? You aimed for 15 and it was really, really challenging to get the right number of participants who met all of the inclusion criteria. So you ended up with 11. Talk about that here. Okay. Where did you collect those data? How frequently did you collect data? Were you conducting classroom observations where you performed 3 observations in each classroom and they each lasted for half an hour? Or did you do 1 observation with each classroom and it lasted for 45 minutes? Did you interview each participant once? Or did you interview participants multiple times? Okay, you want all of that detail in here. Talk about how you recorded your data. Okay, very likely some kind of audio recording. Okay, visual recording is less common, sometimes might be appropriate, but certainly less common. Okay, so how did you record those data? You know, now that everybody's using Zoom, we have a whole new way to integrate the audio recording. Okay, but if you used a good old fashioned, audio recorder, that's fine too. You just talk about that here. Any variations from the plan you presented in your methods chapter? This is where you talk about that. Anything unusual that happened in data collection, like say a global pandemic. Okay, that might count as something unusual that happened to a lot of us during data collection, right? So this is where you talk about it. And again, as you are writing, be thinking about holding the reader's hand, but also putting everything into context for the reader. So you want to provide the depth of information so that readers can understand and make sense and contextualize your results. Often you'll also see a data analysis section in the results chapter. Again, depending on what school you are at, this may be something that you talk about in your methods chapter. I've seen this both ways, but as I said, you know, what I am presenting here is kind of a composite of requirements from several different schools. And these are the sections that come up most frequently. So even if you write your results chapter and include all of these sections, and your chair or another reviewer comes back and says, well, this section needs to go in your methods section. Well, that's great. All you have to do is cut and paste because it's already written. Okay, so if you have these, you are good to go. So in your data analysis section, this is where you talk about the application of how you proposed to analyze your data in your methods chapter, how you actually use this with your own data, how you applied that analytic method to your specific data. So you describe how you analyzed your data and moving from those initial codes to building larger categories, the patterns, okay, that you see across all of your data. Describe and define the codes and the categories that you identified. So all data analysis in qualitative data analysis is really this process of reduction and reducing all of this textual qualitative data into these sort of key categories, right, that are patterned based on your participants. So you want to talk about and define what those categories are, what they mean. And then you want to identify and describe any discrepant cases. You will sometimes hear these referred to as negative cases. So in this section of your results chapter, you will describe how they fit into your analysis. In the results section, you talk about those discrepant cases. So discrepant cases are those where the participant, maybe for some kind of facet of what, you know, whatever phenomenon you're looking at, maybe they don't, maybe one participant doesn't fit into the overall pattern that you're seeing amongst other participants. Okay, and that's perfectly fine, but you want to talk about how you are going to handle those, because we don't just toss them aside. They're still important for understanding the phenomenon, understanding the dimensions of the phenomenon, pointing us to new ideas, new avenues for research. Okay, so you talk about how you factor those into the analysis in this section. Okay, and for those who are interested in knowing more about data analysis, moving from codes to categories, this, themes, categorization, I do have a separate webinar on data analysis. And so in this webinar, this is a much higher level overview. I don't get into detail on data analysis, but I do have another webinar. So please be on the lookout for that if this is something that, that you're interested in, if this is the point that you're at in your dissertation journey. So let's talk about how to present your results, because even though we've spent a lot of time on the previous sections, and they're all important, your presentation of results is by far the most important, the bulk of your results chapter. Your results can be organized in different ways. There is no one size fits all here, okay? And what you'll need to do is kind of think about what makes the most sense for your own study when you're deciding how to organize your results. So sometimes it is most useful to organize your results by the findings as they relate to your research questions. Okay, so you might have two categories that address research question one. So you organize it around research question one, then you talk about those two categories. Research question two, maybe there's one category that addresses that, and so on and so forth. It might, though, be the case that it is more helpful and it makes more sense for your study to organize by category or theme. Okay, this can be really helpful when one theme kind of builds on another. So this can maybe help if you are really interested in focusing on the relationships between the themes and really highlighting that in the discussion. Okay, so there's not, as I said, there's not a one size fits all approach here. It's just something that you have to think about in the context of your own study. So different ways to organize your results. As you present your data, so again, either by research question or by category or theme, the narrative, and this should be mostly narrative, should be your own words. Okay. However, you want to support your findings, your words, the results, using excerpts from focus groups, from interviews, supporting quotes from participants. Okay, this helps show the reader that you didn't just make up these categories kind of out of thin air, right? That you have support, that you can show that participants 2, 5, and 8 all said something related to this facet of the phenomenon that you are studying. Okay, and so there is justification for this category then, because enough participants have talked about it. So it should be mostly narrative in your own words, and you should support this using quotes from your participants. You may, if you are doing, say, a case study and have multiple forms of data collection, you might use excerpts from documents. If you have done observations and there is a, maybe visual component to this, you might use photographs. That might be appropriate. Okay. You discuss your data and interpret if appropriate. And I say if appropriate because most often the discussion and interpretation of results happens in your discussion chapter. Okay, the chapter that comes after the results. So typically your results chapter and your discussion chapter are separate, which I realize is kind of, I think for some of us hard to wrap our heads around, because at least, to me, in my experience, it makes a lot of sense to present my results and then talk about them at the same time, right? Discuss, interpret them at the same time. But that's not common in dissertations. However, interpretative phenomenological analysis IPA for short. In IPA studies, you would provide discussion and interpretation of your results. It's a very specific design and analytic method. Okay. And so this is the sort of asterisk, if appropriate, right? It would be the IPA. And again, as a reminder, this should be all very logical and clear to the reader. The presentation of your data, the organization of the data should be clear. Remember, you're holding their hand. They don't want any surprises. Everything should flow. Everything should make good, logical sense. Now, I mentioned before that in the data analysis section, we talk about how we handle discrepant cases or negative cases. So again, these are those situations where a participant may disconfirm your major findings. So it might be the case that after your data analysis, you have 4 overarching categories that summarize the experience of the phenomenon that you are studying. Okay, and maybe within the second category, you have support from 8 of your participants who all experience this phenomenon in relatively the same way. But you have one participant who had a totally different experience. This is important. We have to factor this in. It can allow us to generate alternate explanations. It illustrates variations in experiences. So we would discuss this in the context of the category. It's not likely that the participant is so different that their experience for every category was different. If that was the case, then you would talk about that for every category. Okay, but you talk about it at that category level, or if you're doing a thematic analysis and you're calling them themes instead of categories, you would talk about that at the level of the theme, or maybe it's at the level of the sub-theme. Okay, so you talk about it at that level in your results section. There are also different ways to visualize findings. As I have said, narrative is the most common, and you will, without question, have narrative in your findings. Okay, that will be the bulk of your results chapter. But you can also use tables. You can use figures. You can use maps. Maybe maps are appropriate if you're conducting classroom observations, and it's important for your reader to understand the layout of the classroom, to understand the context in which actions occur. So you might have maps, you might have drawings. Okay. You can use any of these as appropriate for your own study. The main thing is that when you use any of these, they also need to be described in the text or in the narrative. You can't just surprise your reader with a table and have nothing written about what is presented in the table, or, surprise them with a map. Okay, here's a map, but we don't know what it's about. You have to tell them. Remember, no surprises. Okay, so holding the reader's hand, making sure that everything is clear and logical. So the penultimate section is usually trustworthiness. And this is another section that's kind of a revisiting of your methods chapter, because you likely wrote something about trustworthiness in your methods chapter. In your results chapter, again, you can think of this as the, in the methods chapter, you talked about how you were going to establish trustworthiness in a perfect world if everything goes exactly according to plan. In your results chapter, you talk about what actually happened and how you established trustworthiness, and if that varied at all from what you planned to do. And that's perfectly okay. So there are 4 components of trustworthiness that we talk about in qualitative data. So credibility, okay, or how confident are we that our findings are accurate. Transferability. Can we apply the findings of our study to other contexts, maybe a different group of participants or a different geographical location? Dependability. How consistent are our findings if we replicate the study? Okay, and confirmability. Are our findings based on what our participants said or what we think they said? Okay. So, again, this is where it's really important as you are writing the results that you're using participant excerpts from their interviews, from focus groups, so that you can show that these categories or themes, the results that you're presenting, aren't something that you just made up. Okay. And there are different ways to establish trustworthiness. And I have a couple of ways to do this here: triangulation, rich description, audit trail, member checking. These are not mutually exclusive. So, member checking can help establish all four of these. Okay. Or maybe, credibility and confirmability, maybe not all four, but, they can sort of, I hesitate to use the term mix and match, but I'm obviously going to. You can use different techniques for the different aspects of trustworthiness. Triangulation is really, really important for credibility, but also for confirmability. Okay. So this is the section where, again, you just talk about how you establish trustworthiness in your study and if this changed at all from what you proposed to do in your methods chapter. The last section then is ultimately your summary. Okay. This is where you highlight your findings again for the reader. You want to wrap up the chapter, paint a picture of what you found, okay, in the summary. So think sports highlights, not play-by-play. Okay, you've done the play-by-play already. Here's where you have the sports highlights. Paint a picture of those key findings, and then transition to the next chapter. This is where you say that the greater discussion of the results, the interpretation of the results, is in the next chapter. But let's talk about the real stuff, okay? Because everything that we've already talked about is real and it's important. And yes, it has to go into your results chapter. But it may be that you are in this webinar today because you are so lost, you are at your wit's end and you don't know what to do. Okay. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say that's probably a fair share of you. This is so common with the results chapter. A lot of times what happens is there's a good chunk of time between when you wrote your proposal, defended your proposal, and collected data. Okay. So now here you are. It may have been well over a year. It may have been a couple of years. Okay. You're out of the writing habit. And that's a real challenge to get going again once we're out of the habit. Okay. Writing is thinking on paper, and we can condition ourselves and train ourselves to do it, which we do in the proposal. But, once you're out of the habit, once you've moved on to different things like data collection, once life takes over, which it always will, we get out of the habit and we spin our wheels and don't know what to do. Okay. So it doesn't matter if I say, here are all of the sections that you need for your results chapter. Sometimes the bigger question is like, how do I even get started? So here are my tips from my own experience for doing that. Okay. You do not have to start at the beginning. Okay. You do not have to cover every single section that I outlined in the order that I outlined it. Okay. Maybe you have a good chunk of time today and, someone is watching your children. Maybe you have an office that you can go and shut yourself into. You're feeling fresh. You've got some coffee or tea. You're ready to roll. And you feel like I can do this. I can take on a large section. So maybe what you do is start writing up your first category or theme, and you just see how far you can get. You'll have days where you have the motivation, right, to do this. Motivation isn't going to come to you, though. I hate to say it. It's not something that just magically appears. You have to make it happen. But some days we feel better than others. On those days, tackle something substantial. Okay. If you're feeling good, go for it. If it's a rough day, if your kids are making you crazy and your spouse is making you crazy and you don't have anywhere to go and you just need to sit with your laptop in front of the television, but you need to do something, make a demographic table. You have to do it anyway, but it doesn't take a lot of thought. Okay. You make the table, you put that demographic information in there, and you have something that you can check off of your list. You've done it. It doesn't matter that it was small and that you did it while binge watching your favorite show. Okay. You have done something concrete to move toward your goal. Okay. So you do not have to start at the beginning. You do not have to go in order. A lot of times, even the introduction and the summary are best written after you have drafted the results, because then you know what you've already said, so you can summarize those a little bit better. Okay. So if you need to go for the low-hanging fruit, do that without guilt. Something else that I think is very, very helpful is free writing and brainstorming. And you would be shocked at how much you can accomplish in 15 minutes a day. And I know that you are all looking at that number and thinking that's nothing, but it isn't. It's a lot. If you can get yourself into a room somewhere where you just have 15 minutes, or you just put some earbuds or maybe earplugs in, and you allow yourself to free write about your topic, about your results, anything sort of swirling around in your head related to your dissertation, you will generate a ton of words. Here's how you have to do it, though. You cannot censor yourself. We want, as we're working on our dissertation, because we are PhD students, because we are doctoral candidates, we want everything to come out perfectly the first time. And this is what really gets in the way. This is what gets us in trouble. This is what will stop you completely from writing, is thinking that everything that comes out has to be absolutely perfect on the first try. That's not true. First, you make a mess and then you clean it up. Give yourself 15 minutes a day to write on your topic, to write about your results, and do not censor yourself. Don't worry about spelling. Don't worry about grammar. Don't worry about punctuation. Don't worry about any of it. Just let yourself write. Let yourself think. Okay. It may be all garbage. You may look over it later and none of it works, but that's probably not going to be the case. More than likely, you will go back, and even if there is just one, gold nugget in there, you've gotten somewhere. Okay. Because that gives you something that you can work with, right? To keep going. Okay. So there's the setup of the results chapter. And then there's the, here's how to get started. And if it means going slowly, then by all means go slowly. Okay. It's just fine. If you're still having trouble, we're here for you. So we are Statistics Solutions. Again, we are a full service dissertation consulting company, and we are here to help graduate students get through the PhD process in a timely manner. Okay. We provide a complimentary 30-minute consultation during our work hours. And that is an opportunity for you to speak with one of us about your own unique dissertation needs so that we can, kind of customize how we can support you best. So our contact information is available here, info@statisticsolutions.com, or you can give us a call. Okay, I believe ICEDs is also putting a link in the chat so that you can click the link to get yourself self-scheduled for a consult. Okay, but we're here for you at any stage of this. So whether you are still working on topic development and are just so excited about your results that you decided to take this webinar, or whether you have your results or maybe have your data and have just been sitting on your data for a year because you haven't known how to get started on your results chapter, we're here to help. Okay, so again, we do provide a complimentary consultation so that we can get to know you better, understand your unique situation, your own needs, and customize a plan to help you get through in a timely manner. So we can do some questions and answers now. I don't see anything in the questions box coming up. If you have questions at all about this webinar, please pop those into the questions box. I will answer them so that everybody can hear. I have a question about doing a case study for the dissertation and whether triangulation is a must or only interviews. Would those be enough? So in a case study, you would be collecting data through different methods. So you kind of have, it's like built-in triangulation. Okay. So if you're only doing interviews, it may not actually be a case study. The idea with a case study is that you get really in depth in one case that you're investigating. So you would probably be doing interviews, you might be doing document analysis or observations, and right there, then you have different data collection methods and boom, built-in triangulation. The next question is, do I have any thoughts on free writing and brainstorming on paper versus computer? This is a great question. Really, it is up to you. So I grew up in the digital age. I'm a super fast typer. So for me, it made a lot of sense to brainstorm on the computer. I found that I could just generate a lot of words that way. If that's not you, that's totally fine too. Absolutely use pen and paper. It's whatever works best. Okay. The goal is to, support yourself. So what makes the most sense for you in terms of free writing, in terms of brainstorming? If it's computer, then that's great. And if it's just pen and paper, that's awesome as well. So we have another question about research using secondary data. Yeah, there are a lot of, secondary data can absolutely be used in qualitative research. Yes. So, kind of depending on what it is, something like a content analysis, a document analysis might be useful. Yep. And that all fits within the scope of, what we do and what we can do here at Statistics Solutions. I have another question about 19 semi-structured interviews and a case study. Are these enough? Without knowing about, your design or anything, I would say they probably are for a case study. You're probably at data saturation for the interviews. But again, if you're doing a case study, then you would also be looking at some other angles for data collection. So whether that's a document analysis or maybe some kind of visual component or observations, you would want to add those in. Are there other questions that I can help out with? If so, you can pop those into the questions box. Okay, I don't see any other questions coming in. Okay. Oh, I do have a couple that just came in. Great. So in case study triangulation, what is my opinion about semi-structured interviews and observations? My opinion is as long as it makes sense in the context of your study. So as long as what you're doing to collect data meets the problem and the purpose of your study and the research questions, then semi-structured interviews and observations are just fine, right? But you just want to think through what makes the most sense to get the problem, purpose, and research questions addressed. Everything that you do related to methods is going to be driven by those three things: the problem, purpose, and research questions. Okay, and everything has to be in alignment. So I've got another question about the IPA discussion and analysis combined section. Yeah. So IPA is just, it's a unique type of data collection or design, really. So it's data collection generally through like in-depth semi-structured interviews and then data analysis with the interpretive component in there. And what that means, and here's where I'll tell you also where I see people go wrong in this, because I think this kind of answers your question, is this is really psychological. Okay, it comes from psychology. And so when I see people using this without kind of that psychology woven in, this is where it can lead to trouble, because you have to have a good understanding of the psychological terms that participants are using. Everything is interpreted through the psychological component. Okay, so it's not enough to say like, here is my theme, this is what this theme is about, this is what participant 1 said, 2 said, 3 said. You're also interpreting what they said. Okay, why did they say this? How did they say it? What are the words that they're using to say it? Why did they choose this word instead of that word? That all gets put in here together. Whereas your discussion chapter is going to be, and so let me back up. And so with the IPA, then you have these two levels of interpretation. You have not only your participants interpreting their experience, but you as the researcher are also interpreting their interpretation of the experience. Okay, so in your discussion chapter, it's usually more of a discussion of the results in the context of other research, what you talked about in your literature review. But in your results chapter for an IPA, then you discuss that interpretation using the psychological terminology and sort of these questions about, how are people making sense of this? Okay. General advice for autoethnography. Oh boy. This is probably going to be one where you do want to do a lot of brainstorming, and a lot of just free writing, because you're it's not just like a journal, right? There's more to it, and so you'll need to be able to move kind of in and out of yourself and your head, really. And so I think a lot of writing around that is going to be very helpful. Techniques for trustworthiness. Let's see here. Let me get a couple of these cleared. Techniques for trustworthiness that are must-haves for hermeneutic, phenomenology, and participatory research. Triangulation is really kind of a staple of so much of qualitative research, and a couple of things related to triangulation that I think are important to keep in mind is triangulation does not have to mean that you are using multiple sources of data collection. Okay, triangulation could be that you're using different participants, so you can kind of frame it in a different way. Also, triangulation does not mean three, even though try is in the word. And I think this also really trips people up because it seems kind of counterintuitive, right? It says triangulation, so we should have three, but that's not actually the case. So, you can have data source, triangulation, participatory research. Boy, I'm assuming you're looking at combining hermeneutic, phenomenology, and participatory research. I don't know exactly what you're looking to do with the participatory sort of angle, but I could see different types of data collection there. The other thing that I would recommend for trustworthiness would be member checking, which is okay. So program development. Yeah. So member checking is after you have analyzed data and you have your results, you basically draft a brief sort of synopsis of the results and you present those to your participants and kind of ask them to reflect on, do your results make sense? Do they capture your participants' experiences? Okay. And there's some good material out there for how to do a good member check, really kind of like get the most beneficial information out of that. But especially, hermeneutic phenomenology has to do with interpretation. So we're not assuming that there's some like purely objective reality out there. So doing member checking, I think, is also very, very helpful for a lot of different designs, just to make sure that you've captured what your participants are saying. Let's see. Oh, it looks like I had a follow-up question about the IPA. In other words, would that simply be put in chapter 4 with a short recap in chapter 5? So for the IPA, again, this is related to the IPA. You would do the interpretation, the interpretive discussion of the results in chapter 4, but then in chapter 5, in the discussion chapter, you would talk about all of that in the context of the literature. So it's sort of two different types of discussion or interpretation. In terms of, how can we discuss the research problem or interview questions? This is something that we could maybe talk about more in a, in a in a consult to talk about how we could help out? Are there any other questions this afternoon? No, you're all more than welcome. It's my pleasure. We're truly here to help. We all know what this process is like. Most of us have been through it. We really, it doesn't have to be painful. We're here to help. Okay, so as I said before, and as Isaides mentioned in the chat, you will get a copy of the presentation tomorrow. So, if there's something that you missed, or if you came in late, you'll get a copy of that. Okay. Thanks so much for spending the last hour with us. Again, I'm Rachel. I am a senior qualitative research mentor here at Statistics Solutions. You can find our information online, get your complimentary consultation scheduled so that we can talk more about how we can help you out through the process. Thanks so much, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.